For nearly 4 decades, Creflo Dollar stood as one of the most recognizable faces of American televangelism, a preacher whose sermons on faith and financial breakthrough reached millions of households across the world. He built an empire from almost nothing, turned a small Bible study into a sprawling international ministry, and became a symbol of what the prosperity gospel promised, that faith, properly applied, could produce wealth. His voice reached farmhouses in the American South, apartment blocks in Lagos, and living rooms in London, all tuned to the same broadcast, all hearing the same central promise. That scarcity was not a permanent condition. That breakthrough was available to anyone willing to believe hard enough and give consistently enough. But the same visibility that made him famous also made every misstep public. A pastor who preaches to 8 people in a school cafeteria can stumble quietly. A pastor broadcasting to millions cannot. Over the years, a series of controversies, a domestic violence arrest that made national news within hours, a widely mocked fundraising campaign for one of the most expensive private jets in the world, years of unanswered questions about financial transparency, and finally his own public reversal on one of the signature teachings that built his ministry, have reshaped how the world sees him. Some of those episodes he weathered easily, brushing off criticism from a pulpit that never seemed to lose its confidence. Others left marks that never fully faded, resurfacing every time his name entered the news cycle again. This is the story of how Creflo Dollar built his ministry from nothing, what fueled the criticism that followed him at nearly every stage of his rise, and how his own words, not a prosecutor's, not a journalist's, but his own, delivered from his own pulpit, eventually complicated the legacy he spent a lifetime constructing. Creflo Augustus Dollar Jr. was born on January 28, 1962, in College Park, Georgia, a working-class suburb just outside Atlanta. His father was a police officer, and his mother worked in the cafeteria of a local elementary school. It was an ordinary upbringing, rooted in discipline rather than privilege, in a household that valued steady work over spectacle. Nothing about those early years hinted at the global following he would eventually command, or at the scale of scrutiny that would one day follow him. As a young man, Dollar's ambitions were athletic, not spiritual. He enrolled at what is now the University of West Georgia, hoping to build a career in football, chasing the kind of future that seemed within reach for a talented, driven young man from College Park. An injury ended that plan abruptly and pushed him, almost by accident, toward religion. While recovering, with time on his hands and few other obligations, he began attending Bible studies simply to fill the empty hours. What started as a distraction became something else entirely. He has said the experience changed him permanently, describing a moment of spiritual awakening that redirected the entire course of his life, replacing one ambition with another he had never previously considered. He soon began leading small Bible study groups of his own, first informally, then with growing structure and a small but loyal group of regular attendees. Among the people who showed up to those early gatherings was Taffy Bolton, who would later become his wife and a central figure in the ministry he was about to build. Taffy would go on to co-pastor World Changers alongside him, becoming as recognizable to the congregation as Dollar himself and playing a significant role in shaping the ministry's public presence over the following decades. In 1984, Dollar earned a degree in educational therapy and took a job at a psychiatric institute, helping students with learning difficulties navigate the classroom. By most accounts, he was good at the work, and it offered him a stable, respectable career path entirely separate from ministry. But the pull toward preaching did not fade, and 2 years later he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He walked away from that stability to build something of his own, with no guarantee it would amount to anything more than the handful of people willing to show up. In 1986, Dollar founded a small congregation that met in the cafeteria of the same elementary school where his mother had once worked, the same building, by coincidence, where he had once been part of the school's first integrated class as a child. Only a handful of people showed up to the first service, a modest beginning that gave no indication of what it would eventually become. What he offered them was a message built around confidence, discipline, and the idea that faith could be applied practically to everyday financial struggle, not just to abstract questions of salvation. For people used to hearing that suffering was simply something to endure, it was a different kind of message, and it resonated. Attendance grew steadily week after week, and within a few years the small gathering had become World Changers Ministries Christian Center. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Dollar refined the theology that would define his career, the prosperity gospel, a broader movement within American Christianity built on the belief that faith, positive speech, and consistent giving, particularly tithing, could unlock financial abundance and physical well-being. It was not a theology Dollar invented, but few preachers of his generation delivered it with as much polish, confidence, or media savvy. For congregants struggling with debt, unemployment, or hardship, the message offered something concrete to hold on to, a sense that their circumstances were not fixed and that disciplined faith could actively change their material lives. That combination of hope and practicality became the engine of the ministry's growth. By 1991, the ministry had grown large enough that it was renamed World Changers Church International, a name meant to reflect ambitions that now stretched well beyond College Park. Dollar's reach expanded rapidly through radio and later television broadcasts, carrying his sermons into homes far beyond Georgia and eventually into other countries entirely. His broadcast ministry, which came to be known as Changing Your World, became a fixture of religious television programming, syndicated widely enough that longtime viewers could recite his cadence and delivery from memory. The physical growth of the ministry mirrored its financial growth. In 1995, World Changers completed an 8,500-seat sanctuary known as the World Dome, built at a cost of roughly $20 million. Dollar frequently pointed to the building as proof of his theology in action, saying it had been completed without conventional bank financing, a claim he repeated often as evidence that the principles he preached actually worked when applied at scale. By the mid-2000s, the church reported tens of thousands of members and tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue, with satellite congregations opening in cities across the United States, including New York and Los Angeles, as well as in Canada and parts of Africa. At its peak, Dollar spoke of an ambition to plant hundreds of affiliated congregations around the world, a vision that positioned World Changers not just as a single megachurch, but as the hub of an expanding global network. As the ministry's footprint grew, so did public interest in Dollar's personal wealth, and the gap between his lifestyle and that of many of the people filling his pews became harder to ignore. He and his wife owned a multi-million-dollar estate in Fayetteville, Georgia, set on a large stretch of land with a private gated entrance shielding it from public view. They also held a residence in the Time Warner Center in New York City, purchased and later resold at a substantial profit, along with additional property in New Jersey. Reports over the years also referenced multiple luxury vehicles, including Rolls-Royce models worth several $100,000, and a private jet that Dollar defended repeatedly as a ministry necessity rather than a personal indulgence, arguing that commercial airline schedules simply could not accommodate the pace of his travel between congregations, conferences, and broadcast commitments. To supporters, this lifestyle was not a contradiction but a confirmation, evidence that the prosperity message worked, delivered by a preacher who visibly lived the abundance he promised his congregation rather than merely describing it in the abstract. To critics, the same lifestyle raised uncomfortable questions about a pastor whose personal fortune appeared to grow in close step with the tithes and offerings of a congregation that, in many cases, was far less affluent than he was. The median household income in College Park itself sat well below the national average, a contrast that made the estate in nearby Fayetteville feel, to skeptics, less like inspiration and more like extraction. Those questions eventually reached Washington. Between 2007 and 2011, the United States Senate Finance Committee, led by Senator Chuck Grassley, opened an investigation into the financial practices of 6 prominent televangelists, Dollar among them. The committee sought documentation on ministry spending, executive compensation, and the use of tax-exempt donations, part of a broader effort to understand whether religious organizations enjoying tax-exempt status were operating with an appropriate level of financial accountability. Dollar declined to fully comply, arguing publicly that the government lacked the constitutional authority to compel disclosure of his church's internal financial records, a position he framed as a matter of religious liberty rather than evasiveness. The investigation ultimately closed without criminal charges being filed against him or against most of the other pastors involved. Legally, he emerged from the inquiry unscathed. But the episode left a lasting mark on his public reputation, reinforcing a narrative among critics that his ministry operated with limited financial transparency by choice rather than necessity. Watchdog organizations that evaluate religious nonprofits, including groups that grade ministries on financial openness, have also repeatedly flagged World Changers for its unwillingness to publish independently audited financial statements, a pattern that persisted even as the ministry's revenue and visibility continued to grow. Nothing tested Dollar's public image quite like the spring of 2015. That year, his ministry launched a fundraising campaign, later dubbed Project G650, asking supporters to help purchase a Gulfstream G650 private jet, an aircraft with a price tag near $65 million, among the most expensive private planes in production anywhere in the world. The campaign asked for contributions from roughly 200,000 donors at a suggested minimum of a few $100s each, and the ministry framed the request as a practical necessity rather than a luxury purchase. The church's existing aircraft, an aging Gulfstream III dating back to the 1980s, had experienced serious mechanical problems in recent years, including an engine failure over the Pacific Ocean and a landing gear malfunction during a landing attempt in London. Incidents. Dollar cited as evidence that continuing to fly the older plane posed a genuine safety risk to himself and his staff. The request ignited immediate and widespread backlash, spreading well beyond religious media into mainstream news coverage within days. Aviation commentators and journalists pointed out inconsistencies in how the ministry described the jet's intended humanitarian use, noting that the cargo capacity being promoted for relief work did not match the plane's actual specifications, a discrepancy that undercut the ministry's public justification for needing that specific aircraft rather than a smaller, far less expensive alternative. Critics, including some prominent voices within the Christian community itself, questioned why a private ministry needed one of the most expensive aircraft in the world and why congregants earning modest incomes were being asked to help fund a purchase that would primarily benefit its senior pastor. Gospel artist Kirk Franklin was among those who spoke out publicly against the framing of luxury as a marker of spiritual authenticity, arguing that equating material excess with divine favor reflected poorly on the broader faith community.
Within days, facing mounting national criticism, the fundraising page was quietly taken offline. Dollar, however, did not walk back the underlying request. From the pulpit, he told his congregation that outside criticism would not change his intentions and that he planned to keep believing for the jet regardless of how the campaign was perceived publicly. He later acquired private aircraft through other financial arrangements, details of which were not fully disclosed, but the episode had already done its damage. It became one of the most widely cited examples of prosperity gospel excess in modern American religious media, referenced for years afterward in discussions about televangelist wealth, and it reopened many of the financial transparency questions the earlier Senate investigation had left unresolved. Before the jet controversy, Dollar faced a personal crisis that briefly overshadowed everything else, one that unfolded not in a boardroom or on a fundraising page but inside his own home in the middle of the night. In the early hours of June 8, 2012, sheriff's deputies were called to his residence in Fayette County, Georgia, after his 15-year-old daughter reported that an argument with her father had turned physical. According to the police report, the dispute began after Dollar told her she could not attend a party, an ordinary parental disagreement that, according to the account she gave officers, escalated quickly and dramatically. The responding officers noted a scratch on the girl's neck and documented her account, which included allegations that she had been choked for several seconds, pushed to the ground, and struck, including with a shoe. A second daughter present in the home that night gave investigators a broadly similar account of what she said she witnessed. Dollar was arrested at the scene and charged with simple battery and cruelty to children, both misdemeanor offenses under Georgia law. He denied the most serious allegations, telling police and later his congregation that he had restrained his daughter physically only after she struck him first, and that the mark on her neck was related to a pre-existing skin condition rather than any altercation between them. 2 days after his arrest, he addressed his congregation directly in his first public appearance since the incident, describing what had happened as a family conversation that had become emotional and gotten out of hand, and firmly rejecting characterizations of the event as a violent attack. He told the congregation he should never have been arrested in the first place. He received a standing ovation from the members present, a moment that itself became a subject of debate about how religious communities respond when their leaders face serious personal allegations. The case moved through Fayette County's court system over the following months, out of the public eye for the most part, as prosecutors reviewed the evidence and interviewed those involved. In January 2013, prosecutors announced that the charges had been dropped after Dollar completed a pretrial intervention program that included anger management classes and payment of roughly $1,000 in fees and court costs. The state court solicitor at the time said the resolution balanced accountability with an effort to preserve the family unit, explaining that the outcome reflected both the seriousness of the allegations and a judgment about what would best serve everyone involved going forward. Legally, the matter was closed, and no further charges were ever filed. Publicly, though, it remained a reference point for years afterward, revisited whenever new controversies about Dollar surfaced, and it became part of a broader conversation about corporal punishment, discipline, and whether religious communities were too quick to shield prominent leaders from consequences that an ordinary parent might have faced. Of all the moments in Dollar's public life, few were as unexpected, or as theologically significant, as what happened in the summer of 2022. On June 26 of that year, he stood before his congregation and delivered a sermon titled, The Great Misunderstanding, in which he renounced decades of his own teaching on tithing, the practice of giving 10% of one's income to the church, which had functioned for years as one of the central pillars of his ministry's theology and, by extension, one of the central drivers of its revenue. Dollar told his congregation that he was still growing spiritually and that his past teaching on the subject had not been correct. He explained that he had taught what he believed at the time, but that he had not yet fully grasped a theological distinction he now considered essential. Citing New Testament scripture, particularly the writings of Paul, he argued that tithing as a mandatory practice belonged to Old Testament law and that Christians living under grace were never meant to give out of obligation, fear, or guilt. Giving, he said, should flow from generosity rather than compulsion. He went considerably further than a simple clarification, encouraging members to discard every book, recording, and sermon he had ever produced on the topic of tithing unless its content aligned with what he now understood Scripture to actually say, an extraordinary request from a preacher whose media catalog on the subject spanned decades. The reversal was striking given how central tithing had been to Dollar's rise. It was the doctrine that, more than any other, had financed the ministry's rapid growth, its television presence, its expanding satellite campuses, and, according to years of outside criticism, the very properties and aircraft that had drawn so much scrutiny. Dollar stopped short of formally apologizing for the years he spent teaching the opposite position. Instead, he framed his earlier teaching as a necessary part of his own spiritual journey, explaining that the path he had taken, even if theologically flawed in retrospect, had ultimately led him to the clearer understanding he now held. Reactions split sharply along familiar lines. Some longtime followers and religious commentators praised the admission as a rare act of humility from a televangelist, a willingness to publicly correct a teaching in front of the very people who had built
their giving habits around it, rather than quietly letting the old teaching fade from mention. Others were far less forgiving, arguing that the confession arrived decades too late, and conveniently after Dollar had already accumulated substantial personal wealth under the very doctrine he was now disavowing, when the financial cost of the reversal to him personally was effectively zero. Critics also noted that the reversal came with no offer of financial restitution to congregants who had given under the old teaching over the years, and no new commitment to greater transparency about how ministry finances would be handled going forward. Theological commentators, including some who examined the sermon in detail, used the moment to revisit older criticisms of the prosperity gospel movement as a whole, arguing that Dollar's about-face illustrated deeper inconsistencies in a theology that had always tied spiritual devotion closely, and perhaps too closely, to financial giving. Taken together, these episodes tell a more complicated story than either Dollar's staunchest defenders or his harshest critics tend to offer. He built one of the largest and most recognizable ministries in the country from almost nothing, using a message that gave hope to people who had little reason to expect financial security. And he did it through genuine skill as a communicator, not simply through luck or inherited platform. At the same time, the wealth that message generated for him personally became a recurring source of controversy, inviting scrutiny that a smaller, less visible ministry might never have faced. It is a tension that runs through nearly every chapter of his career. The same qualities that made him effective as a preacher, confidence, certainty, and unwillingness to back down under pressure, are the same qualities that made it difficult for him to change course when critics said he should. The 2012 arrest exposed a private family conflict that became an involuntary public spectacle, ending not in conviction, but in a quietly negotiated legal resolution that left both supporters and critics unsatisfied in different ways. Supporters saw a media pile-on against a father navigating an ordinary, painful family dispute. Critics saw a case study in how fame and institutional power can insulate a person from consequences an average parent might face in identical circumstances. The 2015 Jet campaign became a kind of cultural shorthand for prosperity gospel excess more broadly, referenced for years afterward in articles, sermons, and late-night commentary, whenever critics wanted a concrete example of religious fundraising gone wrong. And the 2022